finished last time with my talking about coexistence of species through nonlinear mechanisms alone. And we had just finished this one mechanism, which is interspecific trade-offs. Now, I'm going to take 3 minutes to address something that came up yesterday when I wasn't lecturing, and which is about what's a mechanism. So this is it's very important for all of us to be clear about this, and I want to give you some homework about your own work, and we're going to discuss that at the round table. So I looked this up in the Oxford Dictionary because I'm a bit partial to that, and a mechanism is a system of cause, blah, blah, sort of like your general idea. But that gives the gist of what people think is a mechanism. Now, the way I think about it is it's a question of why versus how. Now, I'll give you an example. So my greatest hero in science is Isaac Newton. I think he's the greatest scientist who ever lived. What was his inspiration for developing the theory of gravity? He wanted to know why an object falls perpendicular to the ground rather than go sideways opposite. He asked the why question. 4 centuries later, how many people know who Evelyn Hutchinson is? The person who asks questions about why are there so many different kinds of animals, why paradox of the planet. He asked the question, why are there so many different kinds of questions? So the why question is this question of why do things exist the way they are and not some other way, right? But then you can also ask the question of how does a particular pattern arise? How does something work? How does your car engine work? Or how does your watch work? So if you look at these 2 things, you have the question of why does something work, the way it is and not some other way? And then the other thing is how is something the way it is, right? So you can see the why is a much broader question, and the how question is a subset within it. Now, so essentially, now it really doesn't matter whether you're asking the why question or the how question. If you're asking the why question, you're asking a bigger question. You're questioning, like the philosophers did, why are, the philosophers were the early scientists, right? Why are things the way they are? Now, what my homework assignment to you is to think of your own research question. Is it a why question or is it a how question? If it's a how question, do you want to go back, step back and ask, reframe it as a why question? Because say, okay, I'm interested in latitudinal, diversity gradient. It exists. I want to know why it exists in that way. Why does it exist? Why is it the opposite? But in order to answer that, I have to work out how diversity arises in any location, right? Before I can extrapolate. So it's that sort of idea. It's very important when you're young to really get this sort of very clear in your mind. Why are you doing what you're doing anyway? So some sort of degree of introspection about what you're doing, why you're doing it, why it does matter, why does it matter to you actually, but scientifically as well. Okay, that's my little thing about mechanisms, and I am a why person. I question everything. So that didn't seem to be working. So going back to the lecture. So we were talking about coexistence mechanisms arising via nonlinear feedbacks alone, and we talked about trade-offs. Now we want to talk about this mechanism called relative nonlinearity. Okay? And I'm going to illustrate this using the mechanistic consumer resource model for exploitative competition. This is mechanistic because you actually have the consumers exploiting the resource. We have a mechanism for how they take the resource and affect the other species. Now, we already saw that if the consumer, so this is the model you saw before, way back when the consumers have linear functional response, so you can see that all the terms in that equation are linear, right? Except for the resource term. We have the R-star rule where the consumer that drives the resource abundance to the lowest level will exclude all others. Now, if consumers happen to have nonlinear functional responses, it is possible for them to coexist without any variability through a process called relative nonlinearity. So the nonlinear functional response that we are interested in is this one, type 2 functional response, because it's a very natural phenomenon. All organisms become saturated at some point because their gut has no bigger capacity, or they cannot produce more eggs to parasitize a host. So it's a very natural phenomenon. It's a very natural occurrence. There's actually constraint against maximizing fitness by keeping increasing your. So we already saw that this is due to what's called the handling time, this time delay between actually capturing resource and ingesting it. And this leads to positive feedback in the resource species growth rate. So if we now look at a model of exploitative competition with the consumers having type 2 functional responses, we are going to get a different outcome. Now, I'm going to explain this graphically because it's much easier to understand. So here, I plotted the functional responses of the two consumers. Now, notice consumer 1 has a higher attack rate, but it also has a longer handling time. What does that mean? A longer handling time means greater the nonlinearity, right? So its response saturates at a lower resource density than consumer 2, which has a lower attack rate, but it also has a shorter handling time. Do you see? There is this interesting thing. Now remember, when we see, so what is the consequence of having a longer handling time? Now we saw this yesterday. This is for a pairwise interaction of this kind, this is the resource species isocline. When the handling time is large, what happens is this critical resource density moves to the right, which means the domain within which you get oscillatory dynamics is larger. Okay? So the important point is larger the handling time, more linear the functional response, and more likely you are to get oscillations in a pairwise consumer resource interaction. Now remember, our question always is, if you have a pairwise interaction, can the second consumer invade that system when it's in low abundances, right? So this is telling you that if these consumers now differ in their handling times, a consumer that has the longer handling time will have a greater propensity to exhibit oscillations, right? That's the argument. Is everyone on board with me on that? Right? This is what we did before. Now, let me show you what happens. So let's look at now these pairwise interactions. That's consumer 1 when it's with the resource by itself, that's consumer 2. So consumer 1 has a longer handling time, which means it actually coexists with the resource in a limit cycle. So it's always oscillating in abundance. Consumer 2, which has a shorter handling time, and there's the less nonlinear functional response, which also means, what does it mean? What leads to oscillations in this system? Is there positive density dependence induced by the nonlinear functional response? So what can we say about the strength of the positive density dependence if the functional response is less nonlinear? Is it low or high? It's lower, right? Less positive density dependence, the less nonlinear the function. The linear functional response, do we get a positive density dependence? No. We get it because it's nonlinear in that particular way, in the saturating way, which is what it is in nature, right? And a consequence of that is you get this positive density dependence. And if the functional response is, if two species have nonlinear functional responses, one is less, obviously one has to be more nonlinear than the other. The less nonlinear functional response means less positive density dependence relative to the negative density dependence imposed by the resource species self-limitation. In that situation, what happens is the system actually achieves a stable equilibrium with damped oscillations. So this species, let's go back to this diagram. Consumer 1 is in this realm, right? Consumer 2 is in this realm. Do you see? They are actually different in a very, very interesting way. In the dynamical, space, they're very different. Although in a constant environment, there will be one will exclude. So what happens is that the consumer with the more nonlinear functional response generates fluctuations in resource abundance, and this allows coexistence. This was a mechanism proposed by Armstrong and McGee in 1980. There's a mathematical argument in the appendix of the paper, which I can refer you to. But essentially the point is that consumer one has, so now here's think about if the consumer one has a higher attack rate and both species had linear functional responses, what would happen? Consumer one has a higher attack rate. Say if they have the same mortality rate, consumer one is going to exclude consumer two because of the R star rule, right? Because it's higher attack rate means it is going to deplete, it is going to take more of the resource. But in this nonlinear environment, what happens is that the species, okay, listen carefully, species with the more nonlinear functional response generates oscillations. So that's okay because it's just going to generate oscillations when it coexists with the resource. If the average resource abundance over a period of those oscillations, because they are limit cycles, right? If the average resource abundance over one period of resource the oscillation is greater than consumer 2's R star in a constant environment, consumer 2 can invade this oscillating system, but it cannot ever invade if it's a non-oscillatory system. Do you understand what I'm saying? So we know that a species can only invade if the existing resource abundance is above its R star, right? All that says is the resource abundance has to be high enough for that species birth to exceed its death rate. We all agree on that, right? You can, that's why you have an R star rule in a constant environment. The species that depletes the resource level to the lowest level will win, right? But in a fluctuating environment, now there is no environmental variation. How does the fluctuation occur? Through the intrinsic oscillatory dynamics of the consumer in resource, pairwise consumer resource interaction. If those oscillations are large enough in amplitude that if you take the average, temporal average of that cycle of resource abundance and it exceeds on average, so the average resource abundance over the cycle is greater than that species R star in a constant environment, it can invade, okay? So that's the idea. Now, this coexistence is really interesting because it occurs through a form of resource partitioning. The consumer with the more nonlinear functional response is better at exploiting the resource when the resource abundance is low. Why? Because it has a higher attack rate, right? If you have a higher attack rate, you're more efficient. You can take resources even when resources are relatively low. The consumer with the less nonlinear functional response is better at resource exploitation when the resource abundance is high. Why do we get high and low periods of resource abundance? Because consumer one generates these oscillations. Isn't it beautiful? Like the consumer one generates these oscillations and thereby generating a mechanism for resource partitioning. So now consumer one can use the resource when the resource is low. Consumer 2 can use the resource when the resource is high. There is no extra niches, no spatial temporal variation. They partition the resource cycle that is generated by the resident species. So essentially, resource partitioning occurs because the two consumers exploit different parts of the resource cycle. And that separation, what does it do? Remember what the absolute axiomatic thing is, that coexistence requires that species limit themselves more than they limit others. And this naturally occurs now because you're separated into two parts of the resource cycle, right? You're interacting more with individuals of your own species than with the other species. So you do in this very subtle, elegant, fantastic way, this negative density dependence in the species own abundance. So now their per capita rates become, not in a very straightforward way because it's very indirect, you get coexistence. So that's the idea of coexistence via relative nonlinearity in functional responses. Now I've given the example here for a resource competition. You could have the exact same thing in response to a predator. Remember we had a P star rule So you could apply the exact, these are very, very general ideas that could apply across resources, natural enemies, because they all have this antagonistic sort of a, negative positive or negative negative interactions. All right, so that's the end of lecture 1, which I was supposed to have finished the last time. Sure, yes.
But the type rate and the handling time seem to be very related. You can obtain these dynamics by, I don't know, increasing the handling time or lowering the...
No, you can't, because yes, you can, but the nonlinearity is generated by the handling time. If you take the handling time away, none of this would happen, right? See, that's the key. The handling time, so you can actually increase the attack rate and the handling time because they appear as a product, yeah. But if you took the handling time away, the attack rate by itself can't generate that, yeah. But you're quite right. So the death rate does play a role, and the birth rate, but those wouldn't generate the underlying mechanism of resource partitioning. They will enable, facilitate, or impede coexistence depending on the species intrinsic parameter values. Okay. All right, so let's go to lecture 2. Now, okay, so just to remind you, since it was a long time ago that I gave the last lecture, so I'm really sort of, my central theme is this idea about the interplay between nonlinearity and variability. Yes?
It's not surprising that if you have more nonlinearities on your equations, it will appear richness of different behaviors in a great amount. But if we change the nonlinearities of the functional response to another type of Pauling equation, for example, could we expect the same behavior in our result, in the dynamics of the system?
So you're asking that question because you're thinking like a theorist without thinking of the biology. I'm asked, so there are lots of nonlinearities. I can play all day putting lots of nonlinearities and getting all kinds of rich behaviors, but I'm not all that interested in that. I'm interested in looking at these patterns in nature. So the type 2 functional response is the most common functional response in nature. We want to understand the consequence of that functional response for the larger scale population and community dynamics. So for me, so there's a type 3 functional response, but that is actually for generalists. So it doesn't work for specialist consumer resource interactions. Maybe we have lots of very, very specialist interactions. So good question. I think it's a matter of perspective. If you just want to know, but I want to know, because this question is much more constrained by the biology. And it's a much harder question because I can't just put any nonlinearity and justify it. I have to find the right kind of nonlinearity that would work with but be consistent with the rules of biology. Okay? So that's the difference. Okay, so now let me remind you this. So I've said this, I'm going to say this several times. You get these nonlinearities when biotic interactions generate density or frequency dependence. Okay? And these have to be real biological interactions generating real types of negative or density or frequency dependence. Now, abiotic variation cannot generate any density or frequency dependence. It's outside the feedback structure of the system. All it can do is to modify these nonlinearities in space and time that then generates these larger scale patterns that you wouldn't see in a given locality, okay? So this is why it's so interesting. This is why if you want to look at broad scale patterns, you do have to look at this interplay. So that is what we are going to do next for my next 3, including this one, the 3 lectures. And of course, this interplay has 2 dimensions. There's a spatial dimension and a temporal dimension. And I'm going to talk today about the spatial dimension. Now, to do this, we want to really look at, we're going to think about now in a more landscape, more like a larger spatial scale. We want to envision the world from a broader sort of scale. So the local, so there are 2 spatial scales. We define as the local scale, the scale of a community within which you have demographic interactions, so demographic processes like births and deaths and species interactions. That's where you have your R star, P star rules operating. And then we expand out to a regional scale where you have something called a meta-community, which is a collection of communities that are linked by dispersal. So that's the, and then when you go from here to here, now you have an interplay between local dynamics and variability, because variability in different places is going to modify those local nonlinearities, and you get these larger scale patterns. That's what we want to understand. So we get local dynamics at the community scale, we get spatial dynamics at the meta-community scale. Okay? So before we get started on this, I want to make very clear the distinction between local processes and spatial processes, because now we have two scales, right? So the local processes are just exactly what we talked about before, except now they are going to be impacted by variability. So the local processes are these density-dependent feedback loops that are generated by species interactions within a community. Just what happens within the community, not what happens from external inputs, right? So there is going to be some dynamic that happens within these communities, and that's what generates the local nonlinearities. And there's always going to be some feedback. Otherwise, you wouldn't see them, especially if there's no negative feedback. Now, spatial variation here means a spatial heterogeneity in the biotic environment. So it does not necessarily mean if you had differences in habitat quality, if you have differences in moisture and rainfall, that in itself does not generate the kind of spatial heterogeneity that allows coexistence. This is a very important distinction. People, the common idea is, oh yeah, we had some spatial variation. It has to generate this heterogeneity in the biotic environment. So how would that happen? Spatial variation in the environment has to generate spatial variation in the density and frequency dependent loops that operate within communities. If it doesn't, if it cannot cause that, no amount of habitat heterogeneity or whatever is that you observe will matter to coexistence in that system. So in sort of simple words, what that means is that the density frequency dependence that you observe is not the same everywhere in space. So when you're looking for spatial coexistence, you have to understand exactly how that happens. How is that the abiotic environment, or even some aspects of the biotic environment that's outside of your specific question, is changing those nonlinear feedback loops in different locations, okay? So that's our challenge. Now, what's really interesting is when you do have that sort of spatial heterogeneity in the biotic environment, individuals will respond to that heterogeneity, to that biotic heterogeneity, by dispersing between habitats in a way that maximizes their fitness, okay? So that is really what underlies this is natural selection. If there was just variation in habitat quality but no real heterogeneity in the biotic interactions, those individuals will not reproduce to the next generation. Any mutant that does the right kind of dispersal between biotically heterogeneous environments will increase when rare, and that would be sort of like your ESS. So it's always good to think about these things in terms of what maximizes fitness. So we are going to take the example of exploitative competition in spatially varying environments, okay? Now, we define what a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment is, okay? Because biotic can be lots of things. So you have some sort of variation in the environment that is relevant to what you're studying, and that generates the spatial heterogeneity in competitive interactions such that the relative strengths of intra and interspecific competition is not the same everywhere, okay? Everybody follows. That's sort of very clear, very simple ideas. Now, let's look at a cartoon to sort of make this more concrete. So the really important thing is that there is spatial variation in competitive rankings, that the same species is not the superior competitor everywhere. And that's what I said. Habitat heterogeneity may occur, but if the same species is the superior competitor everywhere, would spatial dynamics give you coexistence? No. So that's the important thing. So here, we have sort of look at these two localities. So locality 1 is favorable to species 1. So competition by species 1 is very strong, species 2 gets excluded. this locality is unfavorable to species 1. So, competition from species 1 is weak, species 2 can exclude species 1. So, what we get is spatial heterogeneity in competitive environment alone will lead to regional coexistence of competing species, right? Each species may have a location where the environment is favorable to it and it can actually exclude the other species. So, what that means is species 1 has the lower R star here, species 2 has the lower R star here. So, what the heterogeneity in the environment has done is to alter generate spatial variation in the R star, okay? But what is that? That's a difference that's generating a difference in the density dependent feedback loop. So, now the interesting question is, that's kind of boring, right? I mean, we know that species in different places will persist because they're not interacting, right? They're not competing, so they will be in different places. What the more interesting question is, if there's spatial variation in competitive ability that leads to regional coexistence, can the spatial variation combined with dispersal allow for local coexistence, basically in your face. Now they are really in your faces. You know without dispersal, they get, one gets hammered, the other one wins. But are there conditions under which dispersal can then allow local coexistence? Okay? So I'll give you the answer and then we work, sort of like a theorem. I'll give you the answer and then we work to get the answer. So if there is this spatial heterogeneity in competitive ability, dispersal between localities, even random dispersal, can lead to local coexistence. Each species is everywhere through what's called source sink dynamics. Okay, so what we are going to now do is a mathematical analysis of these source sink dynamics. So what's really interesting about this is that dispersal can increase diversity given spatial variation in competitive ability. Okay, all right. Now, the conditions for like our model, so if you think about sort of the underlying features of this model, we are considering a patchy environment where there are distinct communities that you can identify. They don't have to be discretely patchy like fragments, but there have to be some way of knowing which are the local communities. And then there is this spatial variation in competitive ability that is arising from some underlying heterogeneity in the environment. And that really depends on your question. That could be a natural enemy that you're not considering. That is like, that's present in different densities in different places, or it could be some underlying physical thing. So what's really important in this mechanism is that the emigration and immigration, that's dispersal, right? Going out and coming in, occurs on the same time scale as local dynamics. Why does that matter? That is the only way dispersal can have some effect on local density dependence. Now, the metapopulation framework, the classic metapopulation framework, separates these time scales, ignores the local dynamics, assumes that there's always negative feedback, that species are always present due to that. So it's a given, right? Here, nothing's a given. We just start from scratch, okay? But then we ask, well, some things are a given in the sense that there has to be spatial heterogeneity in competitive ability, but otherwise this would be there wouldn't be much to talk about. So the point of departure for this is a two-species, two-patch cyst meta-community, and that is only in the interest of analytical tractability. The ideas are generalizable to n-patch, m-species systems, okay? So here is the mathematical model for this two-patch system. So there are two species. Their abundances are given by x and y. And the right-hand sides of these equations have three components. The first is competition, and this is just Lotka-Volterra competition. You have the intrinsic growth rates, carrying capacity, species own carrying capacity, and then, so that is intraspecific competition. This is interspecific competition, okay? Now, this is emigration out of that particular locality. This is immigration into that locality from other locality J. So here I and J refer to the two localities, could be 1 and 2, okay? So those are, and then what we do is we do that thing called non-dimensionalization. Now the reason for doing it is because by doing this you can identify natural scalings of different parameters, okay? So we normalize abundance by the species carrying capacity, because the absolute abundance of a species may have no meaning, but the fractional abundance relative to the carrying capacity can tell you whether the species, how close the species is to the carrying capacity versus away from it. Right? And then we scale the carrying capacities of the two species, but the really important ones are we normalize the dispersal rates by the species intrinsic growth rates. That's really important, because then if beta is less than 1, that means emigration is lower than the species intrinsic growth, right? But if beta is greater than 1, that means there's a lot of emigration out of that system in excess of its local productivity. So that's a really important thing to do, plus it gives you this nice greater than 1, less than 1 thing. And the other important parameter here is tau, which is the time is now scaled by consumer 1's intrinsic growth rate, okay? Now with that, so we get this system. Now what we are really interested in is kind of the worst case scenario. So if they can coexist under this situation, they can coexist under any. The species differ only in their competitive and dispersal abilities. They are similar in every other way. So that's a harder problem, okay? Because you can add other stuff and get this. So that gives us then, some of these parameters become 1, but we still retain these other, so some of these parameters, but let me show you. So so the intraspecific, these things, let me see. Yeah, so these things we scale to 1, okay? So that means we get this simpler system. Now what's really interesting about this system is it has just 2 parameters. 1 for local competition, 1 for dispersal. So alpha here is the competitive effect of species Y on species X, or species 2 on species 1. Beta here gives you the emigration rate of that species relative to its growth rate. And that's all we have to really analyze it. So it gives us this real tractability, because we are only interested in competition and dispersal, right? Because as I said, we wanted to make it a harder problem. So what's the question is, within a given patch then, within a given community, can the inferior competitor increase when it's rare, when the superior competitor is at its current capacity? So if the superior competitor is at its best, the inferior competitor is really at its lowest, right? So it's very low, it's coming in, competing with the species that's abundant. So how do we do this? So now, because this is a 4-dimensional system, 2 species, 2 patches, in order to get the innovation criterion, we have to construct the Jacobian matrix for this 4-dimensional system and get so that's the Jacobian, okay? It's the same thing. You take the partial derivatives, but you have to do a 4×4. You can still do it by hand. And then you evaluate the Jacobian at the boundary equilibrium, which is 1, 1, 0, 0, meaning species 1 is at carrying capacity in both patches, species 2 is practically non-existent, right? That's the boundary equilibrium. Now, why is it 1 and 1? Because it's at carrying capacity. We just scaled population abundance by carrying capacity, so the highest a species can go is 1, right? Which is also nice, because you know that it's so if the other species is 0.1, you know that's what that means. So the dominant eigenvalue, so you do your usual thing, the roots of this characteristic equation, and the dominant eigenvalue with the, your regular thing is positive if B is equal to this thing and with, well, so this is what we need to determine, where B is equal to this thing and C is equal to this thing. Now, that's what you just get if you did the algebra. Now we want to do is, what we want to do is we want to rewrite this in a way that's really biologically meaningful. So you do a little bit of algebra, and you end up with the innovation criterion for the inferior competitor. So here by convention, I'm thinking that species 2 is the inferior competitor, okay? So this is the effect of species 1 in patch 1 on species 2. This is the effect of species species 1 in patch 2 on species, the inferior competitor. So now notice these quantities. This 1 minus alpha is the initial per capita growth rate of the inferior competitor in the absence of dispersal, meaning that's how well it or badly it does in the absence of dispersal. And this is going to become crucial when we consider the ability to increase mean REA. And look at this thing very carefully. So this is the product of the initial per capita growth rates in the two patches. This is the sum of the initial per capita growth rates in the two patches. So you can see that this partitions this thing beautifully into two components. Here you have just competition alone, right? Here you have the interplay between competition and dispersal with the dispersal rate coming in here. So this is why it's nice to get an analytical expression, because we can really see what's going on. Now, my claim is that invasion is only possible only in a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. To find out whether that's the case, let's start by looking at invasion in a spatially homogeneous environment. What does that mean? Competitively homogeneous environment. What does that mean? Species 1 is the superior competitor across the landscape. So if that's true, then we don't need these subscripts because all the patches are the same. So species 1 is the superior competitor. It experiences less competition from the other species relative to the competition it exerts on itself. Species 2 is the inferior competitor across the meta community. That means it experiences greater interspecific competition relative to intraspecific competition. Okay? So here remember, less than 1 and larger than 1 means here that intra is greater than inter or vice versa. Okay? Now I can also, like, for reference, I can give you the underlying papers for this if you want to work through it. Now, so by simplifying the invasion criterion for a competitively homogeneous environment, we end up with this criterion. So this has to be satisfied for coexistence. Now, if you rewrite this, it just simply becomes this quantity, okay? Because they're exactly the same everywhere. Now, let's look at this very carefully. Now, for the inferior competitor, that per capita growth rate in the absence of dispersal is always negative, right? Which is why it is the inferior competitor, it gets excluded, right? So that means what does that mean for the product? The product is always positive. The product of the initial growth rates is, if each growth rate is negative in each patch, the product is going to be, because we have 2 patches, if we have 3 patches it will be different, good thing to think about, then it's always positive, right? So this term is, remember we have to get this thing to be negative overall. Now this term is positive, but what about this term? The sum of the initial growth rates. That's negative, right? So this is twice this negative thing. You're subtracting a negative thing from a positive thing. Can this be satisfied? Can it? You're subtracting a negative quantity from a positive quantity, which ends up being a positive quantity, right? So in a competitively homogeneous, do you see though what happens? We are just doing it. I'm not telling you what's happening. It's just you look at the per capita growth rates, you know this has to follow from the fact that it is the inferior competitor everywhere. The only difference is instead of seeing the regular Allard-Volterra, you're seeing this simpler non-dimensionalized version, which sort of essentially reduces this problem to the essential parameters, okay? And you can see things very clearly. So the point is that there's no local coexistence in a spatially homogeneous competitive environment because the relative strengths of intra and interspecific density dependence is the same everywhere, okay? Now let's look at local coexistence in a spatially heterogeneous competitive environment. Okay, so now there's spatial variation in the per capita growth rates, right? So in one patch it's negative, but the other patch it is positive. What does that tell you about the product of the per capita growth rates? One is negative, one is positive. It's always going to be negative,
differs from what kind of fixed point? Because I would expect there's
It's not a fixed point yet. It's invasibility, which is a necessary condition for getting a fixed point, okay? Okay, so please, yeah, so I will get to that. You can't have a fixed point if they cannot. So a fixed point of interest is, that's a good point. A fixed point of interest is something that's an interior attractor here, which is coexistence. We are asking whether that's feasible, okay? So that's a good point. Invasion, so let me go back to this. Invasion criteria, mutual invasibility criteria are establishing that species can increase when rare. If it is only when all the interacting species can increase when rare that you get a fixed point or any other kind of oscillatory attractor in the interior positive quadrant, right, in the interior of the state space. So we are still trying to get the invasibility because without mutual invasibility, there will not, an interior attractor will not be feasible, okay?
But there might be more than one feasible fixed point, right? So
There cannot be in this system because if you have negative density dependence and a competition by itself in any of these systems doesn't actually lead to multiple attractors under this system. If you want to add sort of other stuff, you can, yes, you can add an alley effect, for example. Well, I mean, that's not entirely true because most species increase when they are, but if you added that for fun, then you would get that. But here, let's get to that. We haven't even got to a fixed point, okay? So the thing I want you to understand here is that you can actually work this out if you measured per capita growth rates, for example, right? If you knew these things, you can, and it really simplifies the problem to the essence, which is what's competition and what's dispersal. So now, because the per capita growth rate in one locality is negative and the other is positive, that means the product of the initial growth rates is always going to be negative, right? What about the sum? Oh, why is that negative? Because the initial per capita growth rate is positive in the favorable locality and it's negative in the unfavorable locality. Remember, species can persist in one place but not the other. So you have positive and negative per capita growth rate. Now, invasibility depends on the sum of the initial growth rates in the two patches. So that's the interesting thing here, okay? So first let's look at the case where there is very strong spatial variation in competitive ability. So what that means is that if the positive initial growth rate in the favorable locality is very high relative to the negative initial growth rate in the unfavorable location, then this quantity becomes negative anyway, right? So one of this is really large relative to the other one, right? And this one is negative and you're subtracting a positive quantity from a negative quantity and you're getting a negative overall quantity, okay? So let me go over that again. So if the difference between these two patches is very large, this one that is positive is much larger than the one that's negative. That's what is meant by a very strong spatial heterogeneity. I mean, people do this in models all the time, right? People say, oh, high spatial heterogeneity, low spatial heterogeneity. I'm giving some meaning to that in terms of actual fitnesses and the impact of dispersal. Or this could be gene flow. Now, so then you you satisfy this condition, and if there's very strong spatial heterogeneity in competitive ability, then that criterion is satisfied, and it is satisfied without regard to the magnitude of dispersal, right? Because beta is positive, but it doesn't matter how high or low it is if there is spatial, sorry. Sorry? Is the per capita emigration rate scaled by the species intrinsic growth rate.
Okay, and how do you guarantee that it's high or low?
It's not high or low. I'm saying that it's positive.
Okay, it's
Yeah.
positive,
But
you
it
don't know
doesn't
how
matter what
large.
its magnitude is because the thing in brackets, the value of the thing in brackets is always positive.
Oh yeah, it's always positive.
So what I'm saying is if beta is very small, you
Oh,
will
okay.
still get it
Yeah, you
positive
still
if beta.
guarantee, okay.
That's what I'm, yeah, that's what I'm
Okay.
saying. It's the magnitude of dispersal in that case. Okay, so let's make that very clear. If spatial heterogeneity is very high, it doesn't matter what the magnitude of the dispersal rate is, right? Because you have so much heterogeneity, even a little bit of a few individuals coming in would actually allow for local coexistence. We haven't got to local coexistence yet, but invisibility. Even a small amount of dispersal would allow the inferior competitor to increase when rare in the unfavorable locality, okay? All right. Now, in this system, in this Lotka-Volterra system, the coexistence equilibrium is stable when it's feasible. So, if they can invade when they're rare, then they can coexist. And you can show this analytically. Now, it also happens to be a symmetric matrix with, so all eigenvalues are real, for example, okay? Now let's consider the more interesting situation, which is that the spatial variation in competitive ability is not that high. So the species does somewhat well in one place, but it doesn't do, but that's not so much better than how badly it does in the other place. So this is a more interesting situation, right? This is really kind of what you want to talk about. They're not that different in their performance across the landscape. Is coexistence still possible? Now, if the positive growth rate in the favorable locality, so to formalize that, what I just said, if the positive growth rate in the favorable locality is small in magnitude to the negative growth rate in the unfavorable locality, the sum of these initial growth rates can be actually negative, right? Then you're kind of back to square one where this is not going to be satisfied. Then the magnitude of the dispersal rate comes into play. Now, so think about this. You're not very different in performance. You're doing badly here, you're doing just a little bit better well here just to be able to persist. Now, how much dispersal there is between patches really matters. So this is easier to illustrate with a graph. So here I have plotted the spatial variation in the strength of competition and as a function of the per capita growth rate. It can be done for any species, 1 or 2, we don't care. And what you see is the following. When there's high spatial variation, so this is where there's very high heterogeneity between the two patches in competitive ability, then of course coexistence, so local coexistence, all species are everywhere, can occur. Basically, you have, so actually no, I'm jumping the gun. So here, where high spatial variation in the strength of competition simply means that the competitive advantage in the source is very high relative to the disadvantage in the sink. So I'm just saying the same thing as before. When it's low means the advantage in the source is not that much greater. Now, so what we find then is when spatial variation is high, coexistence is possible as long as beta's positive, right? Well, it can't be negative, it's an emigration rate. It could be 0, in which case you're back to square one. But when spatial variation is low, coexistence is possible only if beta falls below a critical threshold. You can see this is the boundary between coexistence and exclusion. What is really interesting is if it exceeds, when spatial variation in competitive ability is low and the dispersal gets too high, the species gets excluded from the entire landscape. Why? What happens is, remember what this beta thing means. Very high means the immigration is high relative to local growth rate, right? Local intrinsic growth rate. You're basically like committing suicide here. So and you can only have so many individuals because it's a sort of a system where you're just sending individuals to the other system just to eke out a living there. So the more you send is like going down the drain, right? So when spatial variation in competitive ability is low, high dispersal can eliminate those competitive differences because you're exporting more individuals than you're producing locally, okay? So no individual person, like natural selection would ensure that this doesn't happen, but in a model, you have to consider that, take that into consideration. But this is the whole thing about synchronicity, right? Dynamics are synchronized across patches. You do not get anything interesting in terms of persistence or coexistence. And that's very true in competitive, predator-prey, mutualistic, any kind of metapopulation structure. Too much dispersal homogenizes the local dynamics. So here now we get to really the meat of the matter. All of what I said is, not that surprising. Okay, yeah. So, but here's the thing. So we get local coexistence through the interplay between local nonlinearity and spatial variation, right? So this is how it happens, and I've shown you a model where it can work. Now, it doesn't have to be this model. You can write down the mechanistic exploitative competition model with the resource abundance there, and you can still get these things. It's just a little bit harder, okay, mathematically. So we know that it's true that anytime coexistence occurs anywhere, that is because intraspecific competition, here because this is competition, intraspecific competition is stronger than interspecific competition. Given that in these species, in this situation, the only outcome in the absence of dispersal is competitive exclusion, what is the source of negative feedback now somehow increases intraspecific competition relative to interspecific competition, that coexistence becomes possible. Do you understand? You know the basic Larka-Volterra model for the outcomes of competitive dominance versus coexistence, right? So what we are doing is you have dominance because a species limits themselves less than it limits the other species, and the other species does the opposite. And coexistence is when both species or all species limit themselves more than they limit others. How do you go from one to the other? How does dispersal do that? That is the thing, right? You have density independent dispersal here, which is somehow converting competitive dominance into stable local coexistence. That is really the question here. This is why I said, why does it happen? Why does dispersal do that? The model, fine, you can put in something there, you can get all kinds of results like that. Why does it happen? So here, again, I'm going to give you the answer and then work through it. Dispersal generates, so the reason you get this spatial coexistence mechanism is dispersal generates a negative density dependent effect that increases the strength of interspecific competition relative to interspecific, it is much more general, but I would say competition, but it is true for any system, any kind of interaction, and that promotes coexistence. Well, okay, how does that happen? So to illustrate this, here I'm plotted one of the species, so it could be one or two, abundance of one species versus its per capita growth rate. This is what you get in the absence of dispersal. Remember what that is? That is the zero growth isocline in the regular Larka-Volterra competition model, right? So in isolation, you have negative density dependence because of local intraspecific competition. That is not good enough, as we see, because the other species has a stronger effect on the focal species. Now look at the per capita growth rate in the presence of dispersal. We get nonlinear density dependence in the per capita growth rate. Growth rate with dispersal is higher at lower abundances compared to in the absence of dispersal, and lower at higher abundances compared to the absence, which means, what does it mean? It's nonlinear and it's much stronger, right? It works in the much stronger concave. If it were concave down, you would have the opposite. So this is a really interesting thing. So what does that mean? A higher growth rate at low abundances means that it enhances the ability of species to recover from low density, right? A lower growth rate at high abundances increases negative density dependence and the stability of this coexistence equilibrium. Now keep in mind, all this is happening with density independent dispersal interacting with local dynamics. This is why I said it's very important that emigration and immigration occurs on the same time scale as local dynamics. And in many real systems, I study insects in real life, that is what happens. You don't have like things coming in from once 100 years. You do, but you also still have emigration and immigration on the time scale of a generation. So we're talking about that system. So what that means is the net result is that there's stable coexistence of species that would otherwise exclude each other. All right. Now, okay, so I just said that there's negative feedback due to dispersal. I showed you a graph, but do you really know that that happens? So let's actually go through that. So here's a model. There's beta, the normalized beta, and that's alpha, the competition coefficient. Let us look at species I, could be 1 or 2, per capita growth rate when it's rare in the presence of dispersal. Now look at this. Without dispersal, that's what you get, right? That's your linear isocline, right? Are you all right? Yeah, okay. So look at this is your linear isocline in the absence of dispersal, right? This is your emigration rate, and that's your immigration rate, which now is a decreasing function of the species abundance. What does that look like to you? What is that generating? Exactly, nonlinear density dependence, nonlinear dependence of the species per capita growth rate on its own density. Do you see? That's the beauty of this thing, that it actually generates a density-dependent effect akin to intraspecific competition. Dispersal, this random dispersal is not generating competition. That's gentleman in the black shirt. I don't know your name. Victor. So here's an interesting thing that propped up, okay? By just through looking through the So that is something you would not have expected with, if you just added nonlinearities and tried, you would never get that, or you would never think to look at that, right? But this is really interesting because you sort of follow the logic of the rules of the biology. You ask, well, okay, I'm getting that, yes, but what does that mean? Why am I getting a nonlinear feedback? And here is the answer. So this is this negative density dependence that increases species' ability to limit themselves more than they limit others, okay? So that is our foray into interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation, a case study with exploitative competition in spatially varying environments. I'm at an hour. Okay, so let me summarize this. So what we get here is we have local dynamics in terms of this particular model, that particular case study. Not a case study, but this analysis of spatial variation. Local dynamics involve competition. Spatial variation in competitive ability. Otherwise, there's really no point of discussing spatial variation. And dispersal that generates negative density dependence in the per capita growth rate even when it is completely density independent, okay? So what happens is that this interplay between local dynamics and dispersal increases the strength of intraspecific competition relative to interspecific competition, promotes local coexistence via a spatial mechanism that generates negative feedback, right? Because you wouldn't have that if there were no interplay between dispersal and competition. Okay, now I have a proposition for you. I'm almost at the end of my hour. We are going to have a break. I have a section on spatial dynamics of mutualistic interactions, which is where there are alley effects, and we are going to look at a different modeling approach from this one. So you get exposed to something else. Would you like me to continue with that lecture for half of your questioning time, or do you want me to just open it up? Because I want to cover, my lectures cover essentially what I might do in 2 semesters at my university. So I would rather give you the bigger picture, and then, which would hopefully inspire you to go into some of that and work. But if I take this lecture to tomorrow, then I won't be able to cover everything I have. Okay, it's up to you. So if you don't mind, we can go through that and then we can have questions, and then you can also ask me questions at the round table or lunch or any other time. If you want to talk one-on-one, please come and tell me. I'm always available, okay? All right. So let's have a break. Is that okay, Renato?
So let's take a 5-minute break, then we come back for final part of the lecture.
natural or anthropogenic perturbations such as habitat destruction. So the thing is that mutualist systems tend to be additionally fragile because of this preponderance for alley effects. So the question we want, so I'm going to address how mutualistic interactions persist in spatially varying environments. And I'm going to consider a particular type of model which is again like the worst case scenario. So we're going to consider a model of an obligate mutualism where species are strongly interdependent. These are the ones that are most prone to alley effects. And I'm going to consider a pairwise interaction between a mobile and non-mobile species. So this, the obvious examples are plants and pollinators, or plants and seed dispersers, or some sessile animals and their mobile counterparts. Now, spatial dynamics then obviously occurs through dispersal of the mobile mutualist. Now, here's a model that I need to refer to my notes here. Describes the local dynamics. Now, I'm going to, for convenience, refer to a plant and pollinator, but as I said, this applies more generally to other species. So we have here's a single community of mutualists. And this is now, you can see, sort of like a different sort of patchy system, okay? So what we have is we have locality. So each community, each mutualist community occupies a locality with a number of patches. So there are obviously patches that are not occupied by either species. Those can be colonized by the plant species. Now the plant species can persist on a patch for some time, but it cannot reproduce because it requires the pollinator for reproduction. It's an obligate mutualism. So when a plant patch is colonized by a pollinator, you get these plant pollinator patches, okay? And this is then, the model is given by the fraction. So now the state variable is different. It's not abundance, it's fraction of occupied patches, okay? So P1 is the fraction of patches occupied by the plant itself. P2 is the fraction of patches that are both plant and pollinator. So P1 would be for plant. Now that F is the function, F is the rate of production of plant only patches. Fraction G is the rate of production of plant pollinator patches. Of course, when a pollinator comes, the number of plant only patches decreases. And then when that happens, then the rate of change of the plant pollinator patches increases. And then both types of patches have some extinction rate that may or may not be dependent on the abundance of the fraction of patches occupied. Now what's really interesting about this is we have a hierarchical spatial structure here, okay? So we actually do model from the level of an individual. So a patch here is not a collection, but really actually an individual. So for plants, it's really easy to think, you have a plant, a seed that falls somewhere, that's an individual. You can think of that little space as a patch. And then you have a collection of patches which constitutes a local community, and the dynamics of which was this, right? So those equations actually gave the dynamics of this entire system, not this one little thing, right? That one little patch is an individual, okay? Now, then you, on the larger hierarchical of this, largest of this hierarchical scale, you have a collection of these local communities, which is then the meta community, okay? Okay, so now let's first look at the local dynamics of an isolated locality. Now, here is a phase diagram with the abundance of, what is this? The plant pollinator patches versus the abundance of plant only patches. This curve is the zero growth isochline for the plant only patches, and the straight line is the zero growth isochline for the plant pollinator patches. So the important thing here is that you do have here multiple equilibria. 0 is an absorbing state, it's a stable state, and so is this coexistence of the plant and the pollinator, but there's also this unstable equilibrium which constitutes, that is what gives rise to the alley effect. Now, this I did not put an alley effect in the system. This naturally arises from the dynamics of the system. That's the thing. An obligate mutualism represented this in a way naturally leads to an alley effect in isolation. Okay? So, of course, if the fraction of patches falls below that threshold, the entire meta community would, entire community, not the meta community, entire community would go extinct. So, the question we are asking now is, and of course, this happens due to positive density dependence. That is an easier to understand positive density dependence. The alley effect is actually the per capita growth rate declines with decreasing density. Now, our question is, can spatial variation counteract the alley effect and allow species to increase when rare? Because the problem with this system is it is difficult to increase when rare, right? If you perturb below this point, the whole system goes extinct. And why would that happen? So, the plants are there, but there are not enough pollinators. Or if the plants are low, pollinators cannot find the plants, then the plant patch number goes down and there's a positive feedback effect. It goes now the pollinators have even harder time to find plants, so you have this positive feedback, right? Okay. So, now we look at spatial dynamics. Now we are at the larger sort of the hierarchical scale. So, you have one locality with these individuals, another locality with these individuals. Together we get this meta community of two localities. And again, I use two localities because you can derive something analytical that's informative. Okay. So, and now these localities are connected by random dispersal of the mobile mutualist. Of course, the plant's not going anywhere really. Okay. So, only the pollinator is dispersing, which is a very natural situation for lots of these types of systems. So, now these equations you can see are different because now the production of these plant patches and pollinator patches are also a function of the fraction occupied in the other community, right? Obviously, now the production is not a function of just that, the dynamics of that local community, but through dispersal now they become functions of the other occupancy level at the other community as well. And I here denotes dispersal, the dispersal coefficient, which I have not defined here. So, this is just a general notation. And then everything else is just the same. But the difference here between before and now is that you are now the coexistence of this locality is not independent of what happens in the other locality. Because now we are in a better position to understand that, having seen competition, because you use dispersal, there is possibility. You can even anticipate what's going to happen here, right? There is a possibility for dispersal to alter the nature of density dependence in each of the communities, right? So, because we saw the earlier problems, we kind of have a better understanding of what's to come. And indeed, if you look at the phase diagrams now for the isolated community that you saw before, compared to a phase diagram of a community connected by dispersal of the pollinator, you see that the alley effect has disappeared. So, now with dispersal of the pollinator between the two patches, the dynamics of this, actual sort of the dynamical structure of this system is actually altered such that species can now increase when rare. Okay. But again, the thing is, dispersal is completely density independent. This is a very different kind of model, right? It's not immigration and emigration either. It's really dispersal amongst these sort of occupancy type. This is actually the dispersal, the way, okay, so the point here, in fact, the reason, apart from the fact that mutualisms are really inherently interesting, is that I want to show you that this result of the effective dispersal on local density dependence is robust across interactions, across different modeling frameworks, okay? Because we are modeling this very, very differently from like the Lord-Covertell approach. Here we are just looking at occupancy, colonization, extinction, right? No emigration, immigration in the real sense. So what happens is that dispersal, so I'm going to do this very quickly because I want to have time for questions. Dispersal itself is density independent, but it generates this negative density dependence now, which now counteracts the inherent positive density dependence that occurs with these obligate mutualistic interaction. So now what happens is that the alley effect can, the positive density dependence induced by the alley effect can be counteracted by the negative density dependence induced by dispersal. So to show you that, so here in the isolated community, you saw this before, that's the isocline for the plant pollinator patches, right? It was a straight horizontal line. Now you see when it's connected, you get this. Actually, there's no density dependence, and now you actually have density dependence of the right kind, a negative feedback, right? These patches can increase when they're rare, but when they're abundant, the rate at which they increase is the per capita growth is much so. So it's your standard negative feedback. The system is actually, not only is it more coexistence possible, it's actually much more stable now. So this is really the sort of the interesting thing is dispersal generates this negative density dependence that is similar to intraspecific competition, but it does not induce any kind of competition. Is that it actually only increases the negative density dependence in the per capita growth rate of a given species, which is exactly what happens if you had intraspecific competition. So it's a very interesting idea because remember, in most situations when you talk about intraspecific density dependence, you fall back on intraspecific competition. That is the mechanism we know, but you can actually have that mechanism occurring through dispersal. Okay? And that effect can be stronger or weaker depending on the nature of the density dependence of dispersal, which I'm not going to talk about today, but that I've actually done a lot of work on. So the mechanistic basis of this rescue effect is that the dispersal increases the strength of intraspecific interactions relative to interspecific interactions. Okay, so we have persistence of mutualists through the interplay between local nonlinearity and spatial variation, with local dynamics characterized by positive density dependence and spatial variation in fitness, where some populations are going extinct in isolation, some communities, and others are persistent, and we have dispersal, random dispersal generating a negative feedback effect. So that then you get this counteraction of the positive feedback. So to sort of sum up the larger message from this section is that in isolation you have competitive interactions that are subject to the R-star rule, leading to competitive exclusion. Mutualistic interactions, especially obligate mutualistic interactions, are very prone to alley effects. They are also very susceptible to extinction, deterministic extinction, when they are driven to low numbers. So in the case of competition, what you have is competitively heterogeneous environment generated by some underlying heterogeneity in the biotic or the abiotic factors operating in that system, combined with random dispersal, can give you stable local competitive coexistence. In the same way, mutualistic interactions, that are prone to go extinct in isolation can be persistent because dispersal between localities can generate a density dependent effect that can counteract the effect of alley effects, and then you get local mutualist coexistence. Okay, so that ends this section on interplay between nonlinearity and spatial variation. For the next two lectures, I'm going to focus on temporal variation. So now we are ready for questions. Renato.
Thanks. The same rescue effect will be expected when working with both mobile species or both sessile?
Yes, you do. When you have both species mobile, it can, if it's low dispersal, then it can actually strengthen the coexistence. If it's high dispersal, then you have more likelihood of the entire system becoming homogenized, because for the same reason I said before. Okay? So.
Hi. Have you tried to generalize this for a continuous space thing for two density fields?
I haven't. Other people have actually before, almost before I was born, and you get the same outcome. Yeah. So remember, actually, may I say something? And remember, it's not, what's important is not whether space is discrete or continuous. What is important is whether there is some heterogeneity in competitive ability. So like take a grassland, for example, that looks very homogeneous to us, right? But for rodents using the grassland, the underlying soil is different. Some areas are easier to dig than others. So in the same way, continuous space is not really continuous from the perspective of the organism. So what matters is that there's spatial heterogeneity in the strength of the biotic interactions in different places. Okay, that's why it works. Yes. Yes.
So you mentioned the possibility of generalizing these, especially the first model of competition to the situation where you have some arbitrary number of patches and some arbitrary number of species. But what are the constraints between these two numbers? Because it seems like there should be some, right? If you have, you couldn't just have an arbitrarily high number of species.
You would, it would depend on what you're trying to find out. So you could model it on a real competitive system, right? You could say, I want to study tropical forests. There are lots of species. Or you could say, like I did, I want to study the interaction between these two parasitoid species that compete for a given host. Or some other people would have some intermediate question. So the thing is, it generalizes. You have to remember, you can generalize. What is required is that there be sufficient spatial variation. Essentially, it's like having, as long as each participant species has somewhere in the landscape where it does well, it will work. So it depends on that underlying heterogeneity. How much of that can the underlying heterogeneity support? Okay? And so it is not a matter of, so you can generalize, but it will all depend on the reality of it. Can that much heterogeneity be? So if not, you get a limiting, sort of it's like a competitive exclusion principle. There's a certain, so there's a scaling between the amount of heterogeneity and the number of species coexisting, which is actually kind of a fantastic thing to measure, right, in a field. Someone else had a question. Yes?
So these models, the dispersion.
Oh.
Yeah, so these models, one assumption is that the dispersal doesn't depend on the density in the patch. But how biological, meaning if we have this situation of extreme population in the patch and they have to dispersal because of you have a large number in the patch, how in the model?
So I've done a lot of work on that. So so what I did was, so there is an interesting thing, right? So you can move between patches in response to heterogeneity, but you have to have some information that should maximize your fitness. So you have to have an information, you have a correct information. You don't want to go to another sink, right? So I have addressed that question, and then that then defines your dispersal strategy. So random is bet hedging. You go somewhere, you're likely to hit something. I've done density-dependent dispersal in response to competition, predation, dispersal in response to habitat quality. So some underlying quality of the habitat which is independent of the species density. And it turns out that maximizes fitness so much more than density-dependent dispersal, because density dependence is dynamically changing. So your ability to track that is much harder than tracking some cue about the habitat that stays relatively fixed, within the time scale of a generation time. So it matters a great deal, and you get much more interesting results with the dispersal strategy comparison.
Sorry, also with the fitness, maybe the fitness of the people, the individuals that are dispersing is not the same. Maybe it's the part of the reproduction.
It is true. So you can look at that. So then I've actually also done the evolution of dispersal. So it is a matter of, it's very interesting. If you're in a sink, you maximize your fitness by always moving. If you're in a source, so that is what I looked at.
Yes,
So then you actually condition your dispersal on the quality of your habitat. You're much less likely to move. And what that does is then it restricts the amount of overall diversity that the system can have manifest because there's less dispersal, fewer species dispersing, and then fewer of these rescue effects operate. Okay? Because I mean, honestly, if you're in a source, you should just stay put.
Yeah.
But individuals do move. Insects, I study insects, they move for reasons that are incomprehensible. They just leave. So, yeah.
Yes, thank you for the talk. Thank you for the talk. I got a little bit confused with the results of the previous talk about when you are in a very different competition situation. And you said that with any small dispersion, we could have coexistence locally. Isn't this a little bit strange? Any dispersion, 0.000.
No, it is because the difference is so great that difference, there was a term there, right? The sum of and then that difference is so great that if beta were still small, is the product, right? The real question is, if it is large, why does it still work? Because when it's large, you can homogenize patches and eliminate those differences. That's why if you have very, very high spatial heterogeneity, it takes a lot of dispersal to synchronize patches. So that's why it works for either end. So what I'm saying is, realistically, if you put 0.001, it will still work. For it to work, the heterogeneity has to be astronomically high. So you're right. But the fact is, we would, if you were really applying this to a system, we would know. And if it were trivial amounts of dispersal, that would not be a good system for spatial dynamics. We are concerned with species that actually do sample the landscape, right? So yeah. So for plants, it would have to be very, it's only be seeds dispersed. If it's wind dispersed, for example, where it wouldn't be very good for this. So I had animals and plants in mind. Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, it applies to sessile animals too, and where things will move them around or something. Yeah.
Hi.
Yeah, hi.
Thank you so much for your talk. I have one question about the patch model. I didn't understand what happens with the empty spaces or empty patches. Are they infinite? What happens?
No. So that depends on the colonization rate of the plants, really, because think about it. So each plant produces some seed, right? Those seeds have to go and drop in other places. So the minute a seed comes and germinates, that patch becomes occupied by a plant.
Yeah.
Right. So then that is open to invasion by pollinator. So it depends on the plant's colonization rate of empty patches.
Oh, okay.
And that, in turn, biologically speaking, depends on how large the seed size is. And you have these trade-off kinds of things, colonization, dispersal depends on so if you have very heavy seeds, you don't get very far. If you have small seeds that get very far, you will colonize more. So in a situation like this, you would know, so species that produce very large seeds are very viable where they are. So they have less of a need to colonize. So so there are differences in the biology.
Okay, so when you include the empty spaces, you have how to include these as well.
Yeah, so essentially you could just eliminate that and just have plant, and if you assume that the plant can get everywhere, then you wouldn't have an empty thing. But remember, actually the reason the empty patches exist at any given point in time is any patch can go extinct due to external factors. Remember, there was an extinction rate. So this is like the Levin's model, except that it's an individual-based Levin's model. Right? Any individual can die at any time. Right? So there is going to be some fraction empty simply because there will be some deaths or some extinctions. Okay? Good point.
Thank you. My question is somewhere like the question before. In the empty patches, even if you have a non-zero beta, that is the immigration factor that we have in there, what worries me a little is that with a little quantity of population in that patches, attracts indefinitely for the immigration from the other patches. So that seems to prevent that the patches go to zero. So how do you?
So it's because there's a very different modeling framework from the one we saw before, where it was emigration and immigration on the same time scale as here. A zero means that it's not been colonized. So here, when something is persistent, it's persistent at its local coexistence equilibrium. The minute it's colonized, it goes to that equilibrium. So you, in this, the second part of the talk, which I went through a bit hurriedly, it's the separation of timescales. In the first part, the timescales of competition, biotic interactions and dispersal are the same. So then what you said can happen. In the second part of the talk, we are thinking of a landscape. It's mostly like plants. You know, they just go drop somewhere. And in that situation, what you're really thinking is, when a seed drops there, we are really thinking it suddenly become a tree, right? So the time scale of local dynamics is very fast relative to the time scale of extinction colonization dynamics, just like the Levin's framework. So when it's empty. Because local dynamics, nothing is present. So you can't, because there's nothing emigrating on the same time scale, you understand? It's an idealization, but that is why I wanted to show it to you, because it shows you a different way of modeling these things, but you get the same outcome, that you do still get this density dependence that promotes coexistence.
So what it worries me is that the per capita growth rate, because of the immigration, goes to infinity when you go close to zero. So that's what is worrying for me.
What you're saying is when it's, that is true. But that is where the biology will constrain your problem. No species is, so species who do disperse and persist in that way will have a non-trivial dispersal rate. So in a model, you would say, oh my gosh, if I divide by 0.001, that term is going to blow up, right? But in real life, if you're concerned with species that do disperse and persist in that way, they would not have a dispersal rate of 0.001. So we could say, if these are species that hardly ever disperse per generation or whatever per unit time, then this would not be relevant. These mechanisms would not be relevant. Okay? So yes, I understand. And when you do a model, you do have these places where it blows up, or you have it going to infinity. That's where the biology really helps to constrain the problem. Because in a real system, I measure dispersal, it's not that low. If it's really an important component of that species' life history. Okay?
Is your time for a quick one? No? Yeah. No. Well, okay then. So let's thank Priyanga, yeah? And we come back at 2:15, right? So, yeah, thank you.